Sure. Good evening from Shanghai. It's a nice rainy evening here in Shanghai, but we just finished um, our joint venture accelerator, which I'm going to talk to you about in just a little bit. What I wanted to go through today is, following the theme of what's coming in 2020, I feel like Asia is a bit of a unique animal that many people that would be on this webinar might want a broader introduction for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at two different things. But what I want to talk about today is the state of the industry of PropTech, how that's affected by conditions in Asia, especially the diversity of markets, languages, and currencies on this side of the world. We're going to spend a big portion of today's webinar zooming in on China in particular. And the reason for that, I'll explain in just a bit, but the shortest explanation is China functions very differently from the rest of the world, but because of the high-tech society and it being the source of much of the hardware for the world, it's going to have quite an impact. But if we zoom out, anybody in a PropTech audience already knows these things. So I'm not here to just read this off to you, but rather just wanted to put in front of the conversation the changing conditions within the industry that are guiding how JLL thinks and how we approach within the Asia Pacific region, exactly what our tech strategies are, and then how we localize those based on our understanding of these things in each of our geographies. So the one I'd really point out though is this one at the bottom left here, AI, automation, robotics. There's a lot of focus on elimination of human jobs. There's a lot of scaremongering around that. We don't believe that. One of the things that we are trying to do at JLL is actually really focus on augmentation and how technologies can remove the tedious aspects of jobs and allow our staff to focus on what they really signed up to do. My favorite example in our industry is architects. Most architects, for the biggest part of their career, are relegated to simply creating 3D drawings, or even worse, 2D floor plans. No one goes to design school for 6 years so that they can do those very tedious types of work. But we see software like Foyer, other softwares in the market that I won't mention because JLL doesn't have a stake in, but there's a lot of things that are capable of removing the tedious aspects of work. And that's really what we try to focus on as we go through our own digital transformation. So within the region, how are we trying to reshape the region? Well, most people who follow JLL are well aware that we have a $100 million US venture capital fund called JLL Spark. However, the way that Spark operates in this side of the world is slightly different. They typically tend to follow the business on tech investment rather than our other markets where Spark tends to lead investment and then inject those technologies into the business. That wasn't necessarily a deliberate thing, but it was actually something that sort of came about because we realized that just the way that the game is played overall, how tech is approached on this side of the world, is quite different. So it requires very localized knowledge. And again, I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But we've also localized regional accelerator programs. I'm going to go into detail in this conversation about what I mean by that and why we had to do that unique to different geographies here in Asia. And then the other cool thing to sort of point out is the Techathon series. Now, Techathon sounds a lot like hackathon, but what's really interesting about the Techathon is rather than being a hackathon, an ideation process, what our Techathons are actually employee events for our employees to actually get their hands dirty. We actually give them little missions for technologies, and they'll learn to configure a chatbot, or they'll learn to create a web scraper. Different types of exercises. They work together with people outside of their line of the business. And the whole idea is that people leave these sessions feeling more sort of confident with technologies. Most importantly, that they understand by the end of that, we're not asking you to forge the tools of tomorrow. We're asking you to understand how to use them. And that really lowers the barriers to access in their minds that they create when figuring out how they're going to address digital transformation. In November of last year, we brought 30 of our staff from around the region from different geographies to our headquarters in Singapore. And we train them all how to run these sessions. And over the course of 1 year, we've reached over 5,000 of our 42,000 staff here in Asia that have gone through these sessions. Now that's a small proportion of our staff, we recognize that, but it does have a viral effect within the business. People start to tell people about what they're doing, and it generates excitement. We've really seen people be less resistant and actually more enthusiastic as a result of these. But a lot of our focus in the PropTech is actually on stuff that we can action right now. So I mentioned before there, Foyer. Foyer is a product that our project management team uses to convert 2D plans to 3D views, usually served up in our VR360 platform, but it can also be done in tablet form, and now we're actually working on augmented reality forms of it as well. But some of the other things we're looking at, I'm not going to read through the whole slide, screen cap it if you like, but we're looking at valuation. 70% of our revenue in Asia comes from transactions, so of course things like leasing is something that we want to use technology to better automate. But one of the things that differentiates JLL Asia from our broader global business is we have a massive property management portfolio in Asia. We manage 1.5 billion square feet of property between 4 major asset classes. So when we say 4 asset classes, commercial, residential, retail, and alternative classes, things like data centers and the like, but 1.5 billion square feet is obviously not a small number. We're quite proud of that, and we actually see a lot of opportunity in that, which I will share with you through some of the examples that I give you later. And of course, consulting tools, like we have a GIS mapping tool. Actually being here in Shanghai, we have a Map It specialist here who has done some really amazing work where it goes beyond GIS and is really delivering some interesting insights about this market that we are seeing a lot of differentiation from. A lot of it comes to footfall behaviors and things like that. But when we look at some of the more mature markets in Asia, Singapore and Hong Kong, they have especially low vacancy rates, whereas China's had a lot of a building boom, so the vacancy rates are higher, and those analytics are more crucial to placing the right occupiers with the right landlords in the right location. So I'm going to start at the top and zoom down a little bit. Like I said, we're going to end up zooming in on China quite a bit, like I said, because it's different. But I want to talk about what the diverse challenges are. In China, you have very high consumer expectations around delivery times and on-demand availability. You can get anything from your phone within an hour. It's not an exaggeration. You will handle the transaction, will be facilitated for your phone. Everything happens within the confines of that device. And so the idea that I mentioned earlier, the overarching sort of themes that we want to recognize is one that experiences everything in China. So just below where I'm sitting right now is what used to be the largest Starbucks reserve in the world. It's now been passed by one in Tokyo or in Kyoto, and now one in Seattle. But the third biggest Starbucks in the world, and the hardest thing to do in the Starbucks is just get a cup of coffee, because the whole facility is designed around things like sensory experiences, learning how to brew. It is one of the most Instagram-worthy places you'll ever see. So if you look for Starbucks Shanghai on Instagram, you're going to see some really cool photos because they've integrated experience into it. It's also one of the most is the most profitable Starbucks in the world. So creating a destination, creating those experiences, not necessarily selling to your core business, is what's really separated this particular location. This quote at the bottom is an important one to recognize about APAC. I love this quote by William Gibson, famous computer scientist, who said, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." Nowhere is that more true in Asia, because when we look at places like Southeast Asia, they're lower margin markets, so it's hard to attract business, whether within property business that JLL sits in, or even development itself, or development of new technologies. A lot of the infrastructure can be out of date, so you're talking about lots of traffic and congestion, but even within cities, in that first slide I shared with you, internet as a standard business utility, that has to be retrofitted. High-speed internet has to be retrofitted into buildings. And so that actually creates an interesting opportunity, which I'll share in just a second. And then in India, again, 1.3 billion people, there's many of the same expectations among consumers that there are in China to have experiences and have on demand, except the infrastructure doesn't match the way it does here in China. There's not as widely distributed broadband, and a lot of it's concentrated in very dense urban centers, but those dense urban centers also mean there's not a lot of mobility. So it does create some challenges, slightly different market. I'll tell you a little bit about how we address that and how we're capitalizing on what the opportunity is there. And then lastly, you have Australia and New Zealand. It is a big geographic separation. We don't always notice that on the map, but I'm based in Hong Kong, and it takes me 9 hours to fly to Sydney. It takes me 11 hours to fly to Auckland. So these are very spread out. And then, of course, even within those two particular countries, they're spread out where the urban centers are as well. So even though it has a sort of more easily plugged into ecosystem, because it's much like that from the US or the UK, which I've talked about here on the opportunity slide, it is still very geographically disparate. It's also 2.5 hours behind the main time zone here of Asia as well. So again, there can be opportunity out of those challenges. So when we start from the bottom here with Australia and New Zealand, it is the most alike point of entry for technology. So if you're watching from a startup and you're thinking, where can I start? Hong Kong is going to tempt you. Singapore is getting more and more easy to plug into. But the most like in terms of consumer habits is actually probably in Australia or New Zealand. Within India, you have a huge population of tech literate and enthusiastic talent and a huge emerging middle class, excuse me. So there really is tons of room for growth, and that we see as a big opportunity. So if you look at pure numbers, you're going to look at China first, but China has sort of less opportunity for growth in the real estate market because it's served the middle class for a longer period of time. The term there, ASEAN, I should have used Southeast Asia. ASEAN's an association of Southeast Asian nations, so we're just talking about Southeast Asia. But where we see a lot of potential there is the potential to skip a technological generation just as China did. What I mean by skip a technological generation is China is a mobile-first internet society. I'll show you some really cool statistics around that in just a few minutes. But what's very cool for us is if they're going to do that, it's a low-cost proving ground for those technologies. We can go in there, pilot something, and we're still in a competitive industry at JLL. We can test these on the ground where our competitors aren't necessarily paying attention to what we're doing, because these aren't highly sought after markets. It also means we stress test them under very difficult conditions. So if I build something that works in Malaysia, I can plug it into Singapore pretty easily. If I build something that works in the Philippines, I can plug it into Hong Kong very easily. If I build something in Thailand or Vietnam, it can plug into China and then disperse from there. And so there is a lot of opportunity within that. Some of you who are Japan fans probably have noticed I haven't talked much about it. I will touch on it briefly, but I think the big thing to understand about Japan is Japan operates in isolation. Japan's great at building technology, but especially when it comes to software, Japanese technology tends to be very well built for Japanese users. It doesn't have a lot of transferability outside of Japan. That's changing now, but historically beyond hardware, when it comes to software, that's been the case. But the big opportunity is this great quote we've probably all heard 100 times, but it still will fall back to it, is from Roy Amara, that we tend to overestimate the change that will happen in 2 years and underestimate that which will happen in 10. No better place is there an illustration of that than China, which is why I'm going to deep dive into that with you in just a few minutes. when we look at APAC PropTech funding, this is deal flow from 2013 to 2016. It's gone up like 30-fold. I just don't have hard numbers. I'd rather give you hard numbers so you can get a sense of the story I'm trying to tell and illustrate rather than try and just bring you general funding numbers. But when we look at the number of deals, Greater China was 34. But when we look at what the money that represents, Greater China was 3 billion compared to India's 77 deals that were under $1 billion of total investment. So what you should know about this is China is a much higher barrier to entry. When you want to invest in a PropTech startup in China, you're probably going to be you're investing about 3 times as much as you would say in a Silicon Valley startup. However, India, there's a massive, as I said, tech aptitude and people who are enthusiastic to go into their own business. So they're not looking for as much funding, the cost of living is lower, and so you can actually invest and start to see sort of wider returns later on. But the multiples for China at our last analysis is something around 6 to 9 from round to round. So there really is a ton of opportunity. So we classify China as being a high potential, high value. No question, the population is a huge part of that. But as you saw from those demonstrations, they've taken a lion's share of the funding, even though they represent a small number of PropTech startups. Now, there's an important sort of flaw in that metric to acknowledge. 23 startups, or in the case of what I saw before, sorry, I got dyslexic and mixed up the numbers there, it's 32 startups. 32 startups that are classified as PropTech. But the thing about China is tech is tech is tech. It's really sort of any tech, not PropTech. So there was probably a lot that were missed or not necessarily classified as PropTech because they were either going after a wider swath of how people interact with their world, or they just weren't sort of declaring themselves property-specific technology. So from that time period, from 2017 till now, we've seen that change considerably. And I'll talk about what those numbers look like when I get to our Urban Lab Accelerator, which I've still got the badge on from the demo day I just left. India, again, high volume, early stage, a lot of startups, so a lot of opportunities, but you really got to look for, in my experience with India, what you really got to do is really get down to the nuts and bolts and really, so look under the hood before you commit anything. A lot of great ideas, but then a lot of things don't get past the concept stage. And so you might get a lot of approaches. Someone's got a great idea, they know everyone to execute it, but there's nothing there yet. And so that's where the early stage can be a little difficult to navigate in India. In Southeast Asia, there's high potential, like I said, potential to understand the landscape of tomorrow. It is definitely the youngest market, and it's got a lot of challenges to address, especially around congestion and how people move about cities, because there's more and more urban concentration in Southeast Asia, but getting around those urban environments is very difficult. The number one name in PropTech in Southeast Asia, I want to say is JLL, but the most common, the most household name is a company called Property Guru. Property Guru started as sort of a multi-listing site for residential property, but they've really done amazing things with their deal flow and how people interact with the world. One of my favorite things that they've done recently is they've got an AR lens that you can point at a building and it will show you the vacant units. Now, keep in mind that they started in Singapore. And Singapore, as you can see from the photo on the left, is a very vertical place. A lot of residential towers tend to be at least 15 stories or taller. It's not as vertical as, say, Shanghai or Hong Kong, where the average size is closer to 30 stories or even 50 in Hong Kong. But there's a lot of vertical residential real estate, so the ability to take a phone and point it at a building and see the vacancy, that's a great way to serve up information through augmented reality. So like I said earlier, when we look at a wider market potential, Japan, they have huge tech aptitude, but again, it's sort of isolated tech. China's got the massive market size, but it's still sort of a frontier when it comes to how all of these technologies actually play with each other. One of the big initiatives that if you've done your China tech research, especially around PropTech, you'll hear of an initiative called PATH, P-A-T-H. PATH represents 4 major tech players that have sort of been put into an arranged marriage by the government to make sure these technologies are working together and not in isolation, so that it helps sort of centralize everything. This is still, in many ways, a command economy in China, and so part of that you'll see. I'm happy to answer questions if you want to reach out to me, so I don't necessarily want to turn this into a discussion of the geopolitics of China, but there is some really interesting factors to be aware of if you're trying to move into this market. At JLL, we're trying to do a few different things. We've done cross-sector collaboration with some of these companies and universities. So of course, we have a partnership with the MIT Real Estate Innovation Lab. Last year, we partnered with Infiniti, the car company, to do a lab and do some co-creation around how the experience they try to deliver in their automobiles can align with the experience that we're trying to help deliver for our clients. So some really interesting outcomes, including one that I'll share with you in just a minute, came out of that. But at JLL, we're really trying to combine technology and our property expertise in sort of indirect ways, explore what the technologies do, and then think about how they might plug in. Rather, people often mischaracterize that and say, oh, it's technology looking for a problem to solve. But what we've found is there's sort of the inverse of that statement can also be as problematic. Yes, you can purpose-built technology, but you might end up just plugging gaps in your process. So we actually look at the process first. We've run accelerator programs. So our first accelerator was called Propell Asia. It's an inaugural class. Again, feel free to screen cap this if you like. But we had 5 participants in that. We started with 86 applicants. We narrowed it down to 15. And then finally, we got 5 of these early stage startups. For Propell, this was a joint venture with Lend-Lease, which is a huge property developer. If you haven't heard of them, probably on the wrong webinar. But it was a really great partnership. We're looking forward to doing it again. We learned a lot, not just about how you should run an accelerator program, but also what it means to work with somebody who oftentimes we might sit across the negotiating table from, right? We have a great relationship with Lend-Lease, but we also sometimes have to serve the other side of negotiations with them. So how do you work with someone that does that to achieve a goal that's outside of your standard business interest? Lend-Lease was a great partner. We're looking forward to doing another cohort of Propell, hopefully sometime early this year. But watch these names. Newcon just won HB Revis's PropTech sort of competition. Talix just participated a year after they participated in Propell, participated in Techstars accelerator program in Toronto. Gorilla Space, after the Propell class finished, had raised 1.25 million. Logfront is the only sort of anomaly in all of this. Because they were an IoT solution, and that requires a lot of capital, they found that the PropTech world wasn't as useful to them as the industrial space, so they've kind of pivoted since. But they learned a lot about that in a low-risk situation by participating in Propell. And then lastly, Loretta.io is a really cool one to watch. They're in the middle of a seed round right now, and they're using AI to track footfall, and that actually identifies things like spills in malls. They can actually use the security cameras to see how traffic patterns are changing because there's an obstruction that isn't necessarily visible or hasn't been taken care of. But what it also does is allow to see when people are slowing down as they walk by a particular store. It's basically the same way Amazon or other large e-commerce sites can watch your browsing times and see what you're really interested in. This is basically the same thing for shop windows. So really interesting technology. And again, all of these teams have inspired new pursuits that JLL's made in working with them. And so that was a Pan-Asia accelerator program, but then in India, we actually have created a sort of end-to-end network working with India's government and some of their investment arms to access the entire network of startups. So It started with a hackathon. We've been doing client workshops to ideate with JLL's existing clients. And we ran a startup challenge. So Reomnify was the big winner of that startup challenge, who also then went on to win MIPIM Hong Kong Startup Challenge. So definitely a watch for those guys. But in India, again, we have a massive 125,000 startups within the country. So there's a massive appetite. A lot of people looking at the accomplishments of Sundar Pichai and of Satya Nadella and saying, you know what, I can build something great too. And it's really excellent for us to tap into that energy. And there's, again, a lot of enthusiasm. Just like Southeast Asia, both of them, there's a huge appetite to try things and to allow, they're much more forgiving about how early stage software might actually behave or misbehave, and help to refine it and make it better rather than just say, oh, this doesn't work, which is, you know, one of the big challenges of the more mature markets. I said before, our attitude is that at JLL, everyone can be an innovator. And I really love these two examples. We often marry innovation to electronics, but two of the biggest unicorns, if you will, or billion-dollar transactions of the last few years were Casamigos Tequila, which is just mediocre tequila, but George Clooney happens to be a big backer, and which was bought by Diageo, and Vita Coco coconut water, which was acquired by Pepsi for $1 billion. And again, coconut water is not necessarily innovation. It's probably older than humanity. And so when we think about innovation, we shouldn't be married to technology. But the picture on the right is probably the best segue into what I really want to talk about today, and where anyone can be an innovator. We shouldn't focus necessarily on age. I'm just kind of teasing this out for a second, letting everyone sort of take in and try to figure out what's happening. But what's going on in this picture, the young lady you see there on your right is actually begging for money on the streets of China. So here in China, you really can't function with cash anymore. So even at sort of what's seen as the lowest levels of society, people are having to resort to digital resourcefulness. So she's walking up to these guys and saying, can I have money? And they can't tap their pockets and say, I don't have cash. They're both sitting there with their wallets open in front of her. And so that's really, you know, I think something that's a good thing to take in, just on what it's really like, what this transformation really looks like for people. But really the idea that anybody can be an innovator. It's not an age thing. It's not a technological capacity thing. It's a measure of resourcefulness. And so that's something we try to tap into. I always like to share this. If you want to send me some money and you happen to have WeChat Pay, please go ahead. That's my WeChat Pay code. I accept any denominations, but if you're enjoying the webinar, buy me a beer. So let's zoom in on the back of that. China versus the world. Eric Schmidt from Google, the former CEO and chairman of Google, he uses the term the bifurcation of the internet. Because China has existed behind what is called the Great Firewall, or the Golden Shield Project, which is what most in the West perceive as fully restricted internet. You can't access things like Facebook. You can't access things like YouTube. There's a lot of sites that are difficult to access. Only the ones that China gives permission. So whereas in the West, most sites are only quashed out if they're seen as problematic, right? China has a permission-based internet. You have to be allowed to be on their internet, as opposed to you can be on there until you do something very bad. It's a very nuanced and difficult topic to navigate, but what we need to understand as we talk about this is the habits that have emerged have come out of the separation and the digital habits that have emerged from being behind this and having access to a different network of information. When I mentioned before, we tend to overestimate the change that will happen in 2 years and underestimate the change that will happen in 10. In 2010, when I first moved to China, I lived in this little dot right over here. And there was only 37 cities in China with sales over 100 billion renminbi. By 2018, that picture was dramatically different. 96 cities, just a massive illustration of the amount of, let's say, discretionary spending that's going on in China. China was a society that had to deal with scarcity for a very long time. And so there was a lot of sort of miserly behavior that's becoming less and less so. And so you're seeing that in the spending power, but you're also seeing that in how that spending power then affects the way that international companies are responding to the Chinese market. It's a growth market that's 3 times the size of the US. So I'm not going to get into trade war discussions, anything like that. If you have questions around that, sorry, save it for another conversation. But what you need to know about China is it's still a growing market, especially when it relates to tech, even though the user base is already 3 times the size of the US. Again, feel free, screen cap this. This is actually 1-year-old information. I encourage anybody who wants to dig deeper on this topic, Google South China Morning Post, China Internet Report 2019. It's an invaluable resource for me. These statistics have changed ever so slightly, but a couple important things to look at right here. You have your smartphone user base. Even though 69% of users in the US have a smartphone, it's still about 1/3 the size of the number of people, even though half the people in China, it's 3 times as many bodies, it's 3 times as many phones. So you can see why these are important addressable markets. But this one's really the bigger one here in terms of behaviors. Mobile internet users, of those 753 million, they estimate about 70% of them have never really been PC. They've never had PC access to the internet. They've always done it through a mobile platform. So their habits, right down to things like using a QWERTY keyboard versus drawing a Chinese character on a touch device, their habits are decidedly different. And that's what's really shaping how they interact with their world, and in the context of this conversation, the built environment. And then the last one is really just the critical one. On the right there, mobile payment users. 15% adoption rate in the US, about 48 million people use some form of mobile payment, Venmo, whatever. I've been away from the US for a while, so I don't even use many of these, but Apple Pay. And part of that is because, digital credit card systems work really well for a long time. But people here, 527 million people, about 37% of the population, use digital payment systems. When I say use, they live and breathe these digital payment systems. I'd love to field some questions later, but the gig economy functions quite differently in China because people can do quick microtransactions. I was only half kidding when I said to you earlier, if you want to buy me a beer to send me money on WeChat, that's a common practice for KOLs or online influencers in China to actually say that. Just like when you watch a YouTube video and they say, send me money on Patreon, whatever. In China, you ask for smaller amounts, but you get a lot more because it's a lot of small transactions and they're instant. There's no clearinghouse, there's no intermediary. I can directly transfer, I can directly pay it straight into an account. That's the end of it. What I mentioned before, Eric Schmidt called the bifurcation of the internet. A friend of mine, Dom Penaloza, who is the head of WeWork's technology arm here in China, he uses the term tech decoupling, and I really like that term. When we look at who we think is the big players in the US, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple, Apple's the only one that's seen massive success in China, but one big result of the trade war is sort of backlash against Apple. Not so much against against Apple as a company, but actually more of an embracing of homegrown China tech. So especially companies like Xiaomi and Huawei. And that's again, this is not much different from when I was growing up in the US in the 80s and 90s, and it was made in the USA, buy stuff with a made in USA tag. It's more that than it is an adversarial approach. It's, let's go homegrown first whenever we can. And people here really are proud of things like the Huawei Mate P30 that can have a 50 times zoom, and I can see sort of into the horizon with my camera phone. But you know, Amazon is one of the biggest companies in the world, but in China, its presence is a blip on the radar, quite literally. You can see from the image here. When you look at that compared to Alibaba, and especially Alibaba's sort of direct-to-consumer arm, which is called Taobao. And then, of course, Tencent, massive user base, massive amounts of data that flow through here. This image comes from that China Internet Report from 2018. So again, I encourage you, check out that China Internet Report. This really great information to tap into. So how we approached that from JLL is we actually went into it. So I'm just gonna back up for just a moment. One of the things we took away from this right here, so again, just bringing this image back up, is even the strongest players, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple, couldn't go in and do it alone. And so when we started to look at how we really put our tech strategy into China, we said we can't do this alone. And so we actually started working with Swire Properties, who, much like Lend Lease, we often sit across the negotiating table from, but we also want to try and partner with as often as we can. We got together and said, you know what, China's a growth market for both of us. Let's find some partners and explore technology there. And we ended up partnering with Ping An Urban Tech. Now, most people outside of China will probably have never heard the name Ping An, but Ping An is a household name in China. It's the biggest insurance company in the world by market capitalization. But as a result of being an insurance company in such a tech-driven society, they have amazing homegrown fintech products. But to just tell you how much they're exploring technology, one of my favorite things I learned in working with Ping An is the CEO of the parent organization, Ping An, is a huge Beethoven fan. So he actually commissioned an AI analysis of Beethoven's symphonies. And they have an AI that's in the process of continuing to do that analysis and refine it to hopefully complete Beethoven's 10th symphony. They're actually trying to synthesize that through artificial intelligence. So that goes to show you just how far the exploration of tech really goes here in China. So when we started this, we started a joint venture called Urban Lab. Urban Lab is an accelerator program, but we weren't dealing the same way as we were with Propell in early stage startups. Of the 12 startups that we ended up working with, I shouldn't refer to them as startups, the 12 companies that we work with, only one is still pre-seed funding. And as you can see here, 48% have received either seed funding or Series A. Some of them are as far as Series C. So one of our participants just raised $100 million. So part of that sounds like, wow, mind-blowing numbers, but it also is the sort of orders of magnitude of China versus the world. Most of them are pretty new. They were founded after 2013. So again, 2013 is kind of a landmark year because 2013 is when smartphone normalization really started to occur. Even though the iPhone debuted in 2007, most people, wide adoption didn't come until then. So you had apps, but you didn't have people sort of living and breathing out of these devices. And so these are all, again, sort of mobile first sort of thinking, because that's how many people have access to the internet in China. What's really cool is we have a lot of robotics and AR and VR participants as well. I encourage any of you, a lot of it's in Chinese, but if you want to add me on LinkedIn or message me on Twitter, I'll send my information at the end. There's a lot of really cool stuff around the robotics and VR and MR space that we'd love to share with you. When we look at what they focus on, we tried to classify how they fit into the real estate lifecycle. You know, how do they line up with our business? So a lot of it was the planning and design stage. Sorry, so these pictures may be unclear. A big chunk was planning and design, but most of it was still around operations and maintenance. China has a lot of brand new buildings, but they're still built and designed to operate just like old buildings. So while it's brand new glass and steel and it's being built very high into the sky, it's still relying on a lot of human labor. So a lot of these tech companies are actually trying to intervene through robotics and other platforms to make that operate more efficiently. And so when we looked at all of the candidates, we had over 117, I think, that was our short list. Our initial sort of screening process was 350 applicants. And so when we look at how that looked, a lot of them broke down into operation and management value add service, or property management, advertising, and promotion. I'll talk to you a little bit about what that looks like, but how are we turning this disruption into opportunity? Well, we break it down into those big three. Value added service, we're talking about interactive robots, how the space is managed. Again, I'm not going to sit and read through all of these, but in our homes, we think of it as smart connected homes. But even in our workspaces, we're starting to see more customization, better experience, even with how comfortable we are in a built environment. The really crucial thing to acknowledge about all PropTech is that consumer expectations of a building for the past few thousand years have been relatively simple. Keep me dry, keep me comfortable, keep me safe, right? And now we've added in sort of the last few hundred years, keep it clean. But we really haven't changed consumer expectations too much. But we look at these three sort of classifications and we see these as improving or enhancing what consumer expectations of a built environment are. And I think a big one is comfort, right? There's studies that show that air conditioning tends to be gender biased towards males, because males tend to enjoy slightly cooler temperatures than females. And so oftentimes in offices and professional environments, females are cold. And so this is one of those things where if we can customize down to almost the individual level, the amount of comfort, everyone has a better experience. Here in China, in Greater China, especially in Shanghai, the outdoor air quality we're in close proximity to a lot of factories. And so the outdoor air quality is very hit or miss depending on the wind. And so we go the extra mile to filter all the air in our office, but also provide transparency about what the indoor versus the outdoor air quality is. So our staff knows this space is a refuge for them. Within property management, we're not necessarily here in China going after process because labor is still fairly cheap. So what we're actually looking at is things like safety, how a building can be safer, how we can predict issues or react to them so quickly that no one's impacted by it or there's very little impact. And then the last one, the advertising side of it is actually just how can these technologies create new revenue stream for the asset holder? At the end of the day, JLL has to appeal to the needs of our clients. And so a lot of our clients are asset holders. How do we enhance the experience for them and what they serve up to people to create new revenue streams? So things like chatbots that save a little bit of the time and the necessary translation, not just across languages, but just expressions for the people that need customer service from them. So when we look at those, what are some of them? What do they look like in real life? Well, one of the more interesting ones related to China is what's called a sponge city. So it's actually using infrastructure design to do two things. The city that I moved to in 2010, when I started my journey here in Asia, was a city called Wuhan, which is at the convergence of three very big rivers, two slightly smaller rivers and one giant one. And because it's there, there's a floodplain, basically on almost all sides of it. That convergence of those rivers creates a lot of flooding. And also it's a very industrial place, so it kicks up a lot of dust. So the government has actually commissioned different smart cities projects to use the way that buildings are built to actually filter and absorb water and pipe it in, not only to control flooding, but then it's actually recirculated out to bring dust levels down, like on streets where a lot of dust is kicked up, construction sites nearby and stuff. So it's actually reclaiming water in creative ways to solve two of those problems. One of the big applications is as more and more public transit becomes available, or the ways that people are moving through cities, we're starting to see things like dark spaces in buildings. So car parking spaces that are going idle for a long time actually are starting to become package distribution centers, because I mentioned before, everybody is on demand. basically any office you go into in China is going to have a package delivery sort of collection area, because people are constantly just ordering stuff right from their phone, and it might get delivered in the same day. And so now these are working as mini distribution centers, and I'll talk about how that affects service level agreements in just a moment. But then that can be more widely distributed into a district level. So we're actually starting to see then the distribution of these channels through smart lockers and things like that, where collection points, because these cities are so vertical, collection points are then distributed on a neighborhood basis, so that people, you're not relying on a human to sit and manage these things. It can be picked up and dropped off securely, and the chain of custody can be monitored more closely than traditional parcel delivery. That's becoming true not just for shoes and clothes, but actually even for things like produce here in China. So we look at what these smarter networked supply chains might look like. When we're dealing with things like congestion issues in places like Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines, we're starting to see that you can re-network things like cold storage to be in close windows and be at a slightly higher premium, but delivered within 30 minutes of need, so that it doesn't disrupt the service of, say, a restaurant. Dry goods, packages, and things like that being stored in dark spaces with a 60-minute service agreement. So again, if you're running a restaurant and you need your flour, that can be stored in a common location. The nice thing about this is cold storage and dry goods don't have the privacy issues that other things like people in co-working spaces or that need to be behind hard walls demand. The lettuce sitting next to the competitor's restaurant doesn't know that it's not trading secrets. There are, of course, contamination risk and things like that, but those are shared at other points of convergence as well. And then the last one, hard goods might have a half-day SLA. But by doing that, you're servicing both ends of the transactions of these types of spaces. The asset holder is able to divide up the space in a more, in a smaller way and yield better returns. And the person using that space for storage is spending less overall because they're only using it at on-demand level as opposed to. So it's very much similar to the way that the arbitrage of co-working or flexible space works, but it's being applied to industrial spaces. I promise I'm almost done, but one of the cooler ones that I like to share with people is we start to see new construction materials arise. Bamboo is a construction material. This is the image that comes to our mind. This is actually the work of some talented friends of mine based out of the University of Hong Kong. Lashing bamboo together is as old as time, I think, as old as humanity. In Hong Kong, it's still used as the primary scaffolding structure, even on high-rise towers as tall as 120 stories. Because it's abundant here, it grows extremely fast. It's actually much safer to assemble than steel scaffolding. So it's really interesting. But what's advanced recently in the last few years is not what you see in front of you, but actually it can be pressed into a composite and then actually has a close to similar tensile strength as steel. So these are really interesting. This is locally abundant, can be pressed and can be used. Now, there's a reason the tallest timber structure in the world is only 18 stories tall. It doesn't mean it can replace everything, but it is seen as something that can be, a more sustainable material and more readily abundant. And as we see things like isolation in terms of this trade war, that's where we're seeing actually rapid innovation in this space, because we need to use what's closer to home. And then one of the last ones to look at is these buildings as the last 100 meters. So in the building I'm in, actually in the space I'm in, there's a drop-off point where it's a smart and secure locker to drop off things like, for us at JLL, tender issuances. So when people have to formally drop off a tender, we have a time and date stamp, and we're able to see exactly when that comes in, exactly when that goes out. We can see who's ahead of it and who's behind it. But even actually the picture that I showed before, this picture at the top here, these are real robots that we're using right now in the building that I'm in. And the robots can signal the turnstiles and pass through and deliver packages as it goes through. So the last one I want to show you is this one right here. One of the last cool tools we're working on is using AR to harvest data. So most people, when they think of AR, augmented reality, they think of what you see right now, serving up information in a virtual environment. But we've been building a technology now that will allow us to use AR as a means to collect information. So we tell it, I want to go check the electrical booth. It will actually navigate me through the space. So it's giving me real-time directions. We can simulate what something might look like on the wall. So of course we can still serve up virtualization, and that's one of the explorations we have. But the more important one, the more interesting one is, like, right now we do thousands of inspections a day. In fact, we do hundreds of thousands of inspections across that portfolio I mentioned before. So we can actually go through and run inspections and start collecting information on the things that we do using augmented reality. We know that's where all the big tech players are going, so we try to follow the why. That is my presentation. What I want to leave you with is, if you're looking where to focus, all of these things at the top are things that you should have already known. Most of this should be known, but if you're looking to Asia, the bottom three are really critical. You need to know the expectation is on demand, and you need to know that experience is everything. But AI, automation, robotics, those changes are coming faster here than I've seen anywhere else in the world. And so be ready for that. I can be reached on Twitter at Scopelessness, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, but I do want to check at this point to see if there's any questions that have come in. So I'm going to just stop my sharing for a minute and take a look. Looks like we've got one question here. It says, Faye says, do you see many space management or space utilization firms in China? Yes, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of varying approaches. In our Hong Kong office, we have 3 different platforms at work at the same time. We actually compare that data. So one of the things we're very cautious with is not accepting any sensor as being gospel. We need to have something to test it against and figure out what is the most accurate, what's providing us the real information. But again, I think there's still room in the market. So if your question is around that, there's still a lot to be done around space utilization, especially, I think, as I mentioned before, in the industrial space, and as the way that today's technologies are reshaping supply chains in this part of the world. There's still, at a broad space utilization perspective, there's still a lot of opportunity. Now, if you're talking about workplace utilization, bodies in space, it's a pretty well taken care of market, but a great product still can't be beat. So that was the only question I've seen come up so far, but does anyone else have any questions? I think we've got about 5 minutes left. I'll hang out for just a minute and wait around. I'm going to keep a Zen-like quiet as long as I can. So I'll give it about 1 more minute because I know the questions do get typed. But like I said, if you want to reach out to me, please feel free. Scopelessness on Twitter, and Jordan Kostelac. You should see the name from when you RSVP'd for this. I'm happy to connect with anybody on LinkedIn. Please, though, if you do want to have a conversation about how you can work with JLL, I encourage you to think about how you want to work with JLL. I get way too many emails that simply say, I think we could have a lot of synergies. We deal in every asset class of real estate. So if you work in a building, then yes, we already have synergies. But try to have a very direct way in which you want to work with us, but we're always open to conversations. With all that said, no more questions have come in, but I thank everybody for your time, and I look forward to connecting with you and seeing you out on the conference circuit and out in the world of PropTech. And I want to say a special thanks to Walter and the global PropTech crew. I also want to congratulate them on their recognition at MIPIM New York and just say, thanks everybody, and can't wait to show you some really great evolutions of the technologies that I just showed you in 2020. Thanks everyone.